Welcome to Crack It. In this video, we are going to discuss a very important topic, which is nothing but what is caching, how we can implement caching in a Spring Boot application, how we can implement Redis cache in a Spring Boot application. So this is a very common interview question. It's like how do you implement caching in your application, and in these days Redis cache is a hot topic, so you can expect this in your interview. We are going to explain this concept along with the code demo, so please don't skip the video. Go through the full video for the better understanding to answer your interview questions. If you like the content, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. If you are not subscribed it already, please share it with your friends who are preparing for the interviews. Let's start the discussion. Why do we need caching? Suppose I have a client. My client may be a Postman or an Angular application or anything. So my client, for any request, it will call my microservice, and if my data is stored in the database, so my microservice internally needs to access my database to retrieve the information, and then my microservice will return the response to the client. So access time for the frequently accessed data from the database is a significant bottleneck. Yes. So let's assume I'm going to access a specific information. Let's assume I'm going to access product P1 very frequently. So if I need to do very frequently, in the sense in a second I'm going to access it for 20 times. For if my microservice is going to hit the database for 20 times, then that's a costly operation and it is a time consuming operation as well. So access time to the frequently accessed data from the database is a significant bottleneck for my entire application. So and also we need to make sure that the data that my microservice returning is always the updated information, meaning the information that is intact with the database. So I know the information that I'm going to fetch from the database is a time consuming and a costly operation. So what am I going to do? I'm going to store those frequently accessed information or the data in my in-memory database or the distributed cache, meaning the in-memory or the distributed cache. So this is why we need caching. So whenever we are accessing our frequently accessed data from the database, it will take much time. So we are going for some technique wherein we can store those data in memory or the distributed cache, and that's why we need caching. So while developing the Spring Boot applications and using a persistent or a non-in-memory databases, yes, we will use non-in-memory databases in most of our real-time applications like Postgres or the MySQL. So we will not use in-memory databases like H2 in a production application. So while developing a Spring Boot application with a persistent and a non-in-memory database like PostgreSQL, the performance of the application is mainly based on the amount of data that is present in the database, type of data that is present in the database, and the access time that is required to access that storage device, which is nothing but the DB. So my performance of my application is based on all these three factors, which is nothing but the amount of data, type of data, and the access time to the storage devices. So accessing data from the database may get delayed due to any of these reasons. So what are we going to do? We are going to use a cache in our application, and we are going to store our data in memory cache or the distributed cache. So we are going to implement both in memory cache and distributed cache. In our example, for the distributed cache, we are going to use Redis. What are the benefits of caching? We use caching mainly for the better performance. Then we can save cost. As I told earlier, for each time if we hit the database, it involves some cost. So we can save that cost by saving the information, that is the frequently accessed data, in the cache. So we can save some cost, and also we can remove the dependency on the external services during runtime. So I may get the data from the database or from the external services, so I can remove that dependency on the external services during runtime, which is nothing but, if suppose I have a microservice M2 and it is going to hit microservice M2 to retrieve some information, so the response from the microservice M2, I can store it in the cache. So why do I need to store it from the cache? The response from the M2 is not going to change often, so I can store that response of M2 in my cache. So in this way we can save, or we can remove the dependencies on the external service during runtime, and also we can save some network time and cost. Also, if it is the database, then it is obvious that the number of hits to the actual database will get lessened, leading to saving the resources when dealing with the frequent requests. Also minimizes the number of network calls. Yes, if my microservice M1 is dependent on the service M2, but I store those information or the response from the M2 in the cache, or it's very obvious that the number of network calls is going to reduce, which may improve the latency or improving the overall performance of the system architecture. So let's try to understand this benefits using the real world example. Suppose say I'm using Flipkart or the Amazon to get a few products. So the product information in those buying sites will not change often. So what we can do, if we are going to develop that type of buying sites, then we need to think that we can store that product information in the cache. Why are we storing that product information in the cache? It is because those product information will not get changed for the every second. If I have some product, the product description is not going to change for every second, so I can store that product information in my cache to make my application more efficient and to perform really better. Now we know why do we need caching and what are the benefits of caching. Let's make a hand dirty by writing a code for the caching in our Spring Boot application. So you need to do two things to make your application or to configure caching in your Spring Boot application. One is that you need to add this dependency, which is nothing but Spring Boot starter cache, and you need to add at enable caching annotation in your Spring Boot application. Let's go to the code and see what we can do. This is the application that I'm going to use for caching in my Spring Boot application, and also for implementing Spring Redis cache in my application. So let's first go through this application. So this is a straightforward application wherein I have two endpoints. One is to retrieve all the addresses that is present in my database, and the another is to create addresses that is used to save address information in my database. So in my application I have two endpoints, and those two endpoints are nothing but one is to create the address in the database, and the another is to retrieve all the addresses that is present in the database. So for that I'm using a controller class, and I have defined my endpoints. So I'll just change this to Redis cache. Yeah, and in the get mapping you can see that I'm calling a address service, and from the address service we are going to the address repository, and I'm retrieving all the addresses that is present in the repository. So I'll show you the entity as well. So entity is also straightforward, and I have like few properties, id, street name, and others in my entity. So in my service class, what I'm doing, I'm mapping my entity to my DTO, and I'm returning that DTO to my controller class. It's straightforward code. Similarly for the save addresses, what are we doing? We are getting the address DTO from the request body, and we are saving that address. We are converting that address DTO to the address entity in this method, and then we are saving that to the address repository. Straightforward and simple code. So what are we going to do? We are going to implement caching for this method. So how are we going to implement caching? So for implementing caching, we need to make sure that we need to add as I told earlier, we need to add Spring Boot starter cache in your pom.xml. I didn't add it yet. I will add it to you. And also we need to use the at cacheable annotation. Let's first add the dependency here. So before we add our dependency, let's start our application and let's see if our application works. So I'll go to the Postman, and I have saved this get address configuration. So if I click, you can see that I'm able to retrieve the address information that is available in the database. I'm hitting it again. While I'm hitting it, you can see that there is a small lag here to display this information. So, and also you can see that, let's go to the console and see, it looks like I have hit the client endpoint 4 times, and you can see that I have this line printed 4 times, which means for each and every time this address endpoint is going to the address database, fetch the address information, and it is returning to the client. That's why that small delay that we see in the Postman. So all the times it is fetching the information from the database, and it is returning to the client, whoever it is. For us it is Postman. So let's now add that dependency to our application, and that dependency is nothing but Spring Boot starter cache. So to enable caching in our application, we need to do 3 steps. First step, we need to add the dependency, and that dependency is nothing but Spring Boot starter cache. Yes, I have added the dependency. Next, what do I need to do? I need to enable caching in my application. So we have something called as @enable caching, that is an annotation, and if we add that annotation to our application class, that's it, all well and good. Our application is now able to handle all the cache related things. So what did I do? First, I added this dependency in my application. Second is I have added @enable caching to my application. Next, what do I'm going to do? I'm going to cache this specific endpoint. So whenever the user hits this endpoint, first time what will it do? It will go to the database, fetch the information, and it will store that into the Spring's cache. Then if the user calls it the second time, calls this endpoint second time, what will happen? It will not go to the database. Instead, it will return the information from the Spring's cache. So to make this method enable to caching, what do we need to do? We need to use @cacheable annotation on this method, and we need to name this cache, because it's not mandatory that we will use only one cache in our application. There may be chances that we can use multiple caches in our application. So to differentiate, we need to name our cache. So I'm going to name this cache as address. So very simple, 3 steps: adding the dependency in POM, adding @enable caching annotation, adding @cacheable annotation with a cache value here. So I'm starting my application now, and let's go to the Postman. And for the first time, I'm hitting the endpoint. You can see that it took some time to retrieve this information, and also you can see that this system.out.print got printed for the first time. Second time I'm hitting the application, you can see that that lag was not there, and also here you can see that second time it didn't print anything. Why? Because it is not retrieving the information from the database. It's not at all executing this method. Instead, it is returning the information from the cache. I'm calling it multiple times. You can see that this value got printed only once, and that too during the first hit from the Postman. That's it. Very simple. We have implemented caching in our application now. So we have successfully implemented caching in our application. I just want to test one more scenario. So for now, I have 3 entries in my database, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one more entry to my database. And for that, I have a post method. So I will create a post method, and I want to save this address information to my database. So I have saved it. I have got 200 response. So now what I'm doing is I'm going to get the information from the address, but you can see that I can see only 3 entries here, and we are not able to see the 4th entry that we added here. Why? Because in the cache it didn't had the new entry. So is this a valid scenario? No, this is not a valid scenario. Why? Even though we have one more entry, that is 4 entries in the database, it is returning just 3 addresses. So this is not a valid scenario. So what do we need to do to make this cache work appropriately? We need to do a minor code change. Let's see what it is. So our condition is like, if we created new address, then we need to update that information in my cache. So there is something called as cache evict. So I want to add that cache evict annotation here. So we have something called as cache evict. So what is this annotation? This annotation will evict the cache. Which cache it is going to evict? It is going to evict this address cache. So that is why we need to give the name for the cache. If I have multiple caches configured in my application, we need to provide that exact cache which I want to evict here. And there are like multiple things in this cache evict. So I'm giving it as all entries equals true, which means it will delete the whole cache, and it will create the new cache, creating it from the database. So I've given it as @cache evict value equals address. It is because my cache name is address, and I informed that all the entries equal to 2, which means that it will delete all the cache entries that is present in the cache, and it will create a new cache. If suppose you don't want this to be happen, there are something which we can configure. So if suppose I have a key, I have configured key here in my cache. So I'll just show you. So if suppose you can see that there is key generator and all. If suppose you have configured key to your application, then what you can do is you can just evict that key here while creating the address, and you can just evict that key, and you can populate the cache value for that key alone. But for now in this tutorial I'm not covering it. If you want us to discuss all the possibilities of at cache evict and at cacheable, please let me know in the comment section. I can cover these two annotations in a separate video with all the possible values. But the intention of this video is using the cache in a Spring Boot application, and using Redis cache, which is nothing but a distributed cache in our Spring Boot application. So I'm not using it, I'm not elaborating it much. So we are just in our cache evict annotation, we provided our cache value and we are just giving it as all entries equals true. That's it. Our code should work fine. Let's see what happens. So for now I'm going to my Postman, and what I'm checking. So in my get you can see that I have only 3 entries with ID 1, 2 and 3. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to add one more entry, and you can see that the status is 200 for the employee ID 4. For now if I get it, you can see that I can have 4 IDs. Previously this was not the case, but now it is working. Why it is working? It is because we have added at cache evict to this method, which made this happen. It has evicted that whole cache address and it has created it again. So if you can see here, in previously when we hit get all addresses, we didn't get this out at all, but now we are getting it. Why we are getting it? It is because we have added one new entry after we populate the cache. If any new entry is added, what will happen? It will delete the cache. So if someone is coming to retry the address information, nothing will be available in the cache. So it will go to the database, fetch the information, populate the cache, and it will send the information to the client. So now if I hit it, will I get that sysout? No, I will not get it. Why I will not get it? Because we didn't add any new entry. If suppose I'm adding one more entry here just for the demo, you can see that now you can see that the address is created. But if we get address, yes, it will go to one more time to the DB and it will fetch the information. That is what cache evict does. So what is this at cacheable annotation? At cacheable annotation, we know that if we want to cache some certain function or the certain methods, then we need to use this at cacheable annotation, and we have to set the value of the annotation, which is nothing but the name of the cache. Yes, in our case the name of the cache is address. We already use it. So if as well as the key for which the data will be stored in. In this example we didn't use the key, but if you want the key, please let me know in the comment section. I'll cover a separate video for this at cacheable and at cache evict. Sorry for the misspelled, it should be this spelling here. And also we can use the expression language, Spring expression language, to define the key in this cacheable annotation. So what is this cache evict? Cache evict, as we know, this is used to annotate it on a function. Yes, we saw that we have annotated this at cache evict on the method, and what will we provide in this value? We will provide some entry in the value. That entry is nothing but the name of the cache that we have provided in this at cacheable annotation. When do you want to use this at cache evict annotation? If you have something added to your actual database and you want that to get reflected to your client, then you need to use this at cache evict annotation. There is a chance that you don't want to use this cache evict at all. So in that case, what do you need to do? You need to configure TTL, which is time to live, properly in your application, like 1 second or 2 seconds. So after that 2 seconds, what will happen? The cache will automatically delete it. It will go check the database, it will fetch the information, and now the cache will have the latest information. So we have to configure our time to live properly in application if we don't want to use this at cache evict. So what will this at TTL do? At TTL, after that specified time, it will not use the old cache. It will go fetch the data from the database, and it will populate the cache with the new value, so that we will not return incorrect data to the client. So we have to be very careful whether we want to use at cache evict or at whether we want to use time to let. We should be very careful, but we should be very careful that we are sending the latest data to the client. For now we have only one instance of our application running, but in a real time that's not the case. We will have multiple instances of our application running in if it's a production code. So in that case, if we have configured just the Spring caching, which is nothing but each of the instances has its own cache. So for now, the demo that I show, I have created a microservice, which is the address service that has its cache. Let's do one thing now. Let's create one more instance of this microservice, and what will happen? It will not go fetch the data from the other instance cache. It will always creates its own cache and it will retrieve the data from its cache. So even though it looks like a problem is sorted, that is not the case. Why that is not the case? We have to create two caches. If suppose I have 10 multiple instances, I have to create 10 multiple caches. So instead, what do we need to have is like a one common cache, which is nothing but the distributed cache that will create only one time. So that will be created only once, and that cache can be used by all the instances of my application. So that is called as the distributed caching. So what is distributed caching? Even though I have multiple instances of my application running, all those instances will point to a single cache. So, and that who is supporting that? There are like multiple vendors who is doing this distributed caching, but Redis cache is like super effective, and most of the protection code or the protection applications are using Redis. So that's why I have opted Redis for this example. So we are going to implement distributed caching in our example. Let's see how. You can see I have made two instances of the application, one with port 8080 and the another with port 8090. So for the 8090 port, I didn't do anything. I just have added my main class as the same as Spring Redis cache demo application, and you can see that I have override the VM options. So in the VM options, I have overridden the server port to 8090. So my Spring Redis cache application will now run in two ports, 8080 and 8090, so that I can make my one application to run in the two instances. So what I'm doing is I'll make this 8890 port up, I'll make this 8080 port up, and let's go to the postman and see what happens. So from the port 8080, I'm trying to fetch the information. All well and good. I can see 3 entries. From the port 8090, I'm trying to fetch. I can see the 3 entries. So what I'm going to do is in the port 8090, I'm going to save a value, and from the port 8090 we can see that that value got added. But in the port 8080 it is not added. Why it is not added? Because this application, this instance of the application is maintaining a separate cache, whereas this instance of the application is maintaining a separate cache. So it is because, and that's the reason we need to go for the distributed cache. Even though we have 4 entries in the database, 2 of these instances will have 2 different caches. So let's do one thing now. So we are going to create one using the port 8080. So we are creating one using the port 8080, and now if we try to fetch the information from the port 8080, you can see that those entries got updated. So from my port 8090, now I can see only 4 entries. This 4th entry is added through my 8090 instance, and that's why it's showing here. But in this 8080, since we have added one entry after this 8090, and if I click get, what will happen? Since I have cache evict in my add, during this addition of that entry, my cache would have deleted. So when I hit this get endpoint, automatically it will go to the database and fetch the information. Now in the database I have 5 entries. Why I have 5 entries? It is because this one entry is added by 8090 port, and this one entry is being added by 8080 port. So now I can see all my entries in my 8080 port. So now this is not a valid solution. It is because one of my instance is returning the 4 rows, whereas my another instance is returning 5 rows. So this is the reason we are going for the distributed cache. So let's implement distributed cache, which is nothing but the Spring Redis cache in our application, and then let's test the scenario how it's working. So to make Redis cache implement in our application, we need to have Redis run in our local machine. So for me, I have downloaded downloaded Redis from the Docker already. So I'll open my Docker first. Let it get open. So you can see that maybe I'll delete it, no problem. So delete forever. I'll go to the images. I'll search for the Redis. I have pulled already the Redis image. That's why I have it here. So what I'm going to do is I'll just run a new container of Redis. So what happened? My Redis is running in the port 6379. So I have my Redis running in my local machine on the port 6379. So now I have my Redis running in my local machine. So if you want to use Redis in your application, you need to have Redis configured in your local machine if it's local. So I have configured Redis, I have pulled the Redis image from the Docker, and I have made my Redis run in the port 6379. You can see that here. So all well and good, my Redis is running. So what are we going to do? We are going to change our code a little bit to make the Redis work in our application. So in our code, what do we need to do? We have to add just a single dependency. So what is the dependency? That dependency is nothing but the Redis cache dependency. So let's add that dependency in our pom.xml. So let's add that dependency here, and that dependency is nothing but the Spring Boot Starter data Redis dependency. I'm using the same version that I'm using for the Spring Boot Starter cache. So both the versions are same. So this is the only dependency that we need to add. So if we just add this dependency, Spring Boot know that it has to use the Redis cache and not the in-memory cache. Till now, we just added this dependency. Our Spring Boot application knows it has to use its in-memory cache, and it was using it. But now, after we added this dependency, now my Spring Boot application knows it has to use the Redis cache dependency and not the in-memory cache. So my Spring Boot application knows. So I want to add one more property in my application.yaml. So which is nothing but the Spring Redis cache time to live. So this, I'll give it as like some 5 seconds. So what is this Spring Redis cache time to live? So the Spring Redis cache time to live is nothing but the entry in the cache will live for just 5 minutes. When it comes to 6th minute, it will not hold the data in its cache. It will go fetch from the database, and it will store the new information that it fetched from the database in its cache. So for every 5 minutes, my cache will get refreshed. So I'm letting, sorry, it should be Spring Cache Redis, my bad. So for every 5 seconds, what will happen? My cache will get refreshed. My cache will go to the database. It will fetch the latest information from the database, and it will keep the DB intact. So previously what happened? We have 3 entries in our database. We checked in M1 instance, it was perfect. We checked in M2 instance, it was perfect. Then we added one more instance, one more entry to our port 8080. Yes, well and good. When I again checked in my port 8080, I was able to see that one added entry, which is nothing but the 4 entries. But when I checked in my M2 instance, which is 8090, I was not able to see that 4th entry. I was able to see only the 3 entries. This was the behavior previously. Now we have added Redis cache in our application, And since we have configured something called as time to live in this Redis cache configuration, so what will it do? This Redis cache will get refreshed for every 5 seconds. So let's consider the same scenario while using Redis cache. First, what did I've checked my M1 instance. I had 3 entries. M2 instance, I had 3 entries. M1 instance, I have added 1 entry, and in the M1 instance, when I checked, I got 4 entries. So if I check my M2 instance, even before that 5 seconds, that time to live duration, or before the, like, let's assume this has been added, and within 5 seconds, if I check my M2 instance, I will see only the 3 records. But if I check the same thing after 5 seconds, I can see all the 4 records. So why I am able to see my 4 records? It is because for every 5 seconds my Redis cache will get refreshed automatically. It will go to the database, fetch the latest information, and it will display that to the instance too. So previously that was not the case. So previously what happened, how much ever entries you created in your cache using that instance one, that will get refreshed only if we add an entry, or only if we have that at cache evict, and if we call it again. If not, that will not get reflected. But with Redis cache, it is not the case. So for every time to live seconds, which is 5 seconds in our example, so every 5 seconds my Redis cache will get refreshed, and it will always give the updated information to the applications. So that is why we need Redis cache. So we have implemented Redis cache. Let's now see the demo of it. So we have added our configuration, which is nothing but Spring Cache Redis time to live as 5 seconds. If we add this as 5 seconds, for every 5 seconds my cache will get refreshed. So in my pom.xml, I have added my dependency, which is nothing but the Spring Boot starter data Redis dependency. If it's enough, if I just add this dependency, Spring knows that it has to use that Redis cache for all its caching and not the in-memory cache. So we need to make sure that our Docker is running. So I have made sure that my Docker is running in the port 6379. So from the Docker container, it is running in the port 6379. In my local also, I want my Redis to be run in the 6379 port. So I have given the command docker run -p 6379. I want to run it in a detached mode. That's why I have given it as -d, and I have named it as Redis. Like which thing I want to run, that is a Redis. So all well and good. So my Redis is also running in 6379. Let's start 2 instances of the application. So one is 8090. Yes, I'm starting it. I'm starting the 8080 as well. So now let's go to the Postman. So this is 8090 port, and you can see 3 entries here, and I'll go to 8080 get address. Let's see what happens. It's 3 entries. Now in the port 8080, I'm saving an information, and I'm trying to retrieve that information in 8080. All well and good. I'm able to see it. I'm going to 8090 and I'm checking it. Yes, now I can see that entry added in 8090 as well. It is because of the Redis cache. We are using distributed cache in our application. That's the reason we are now able to see this entry, that is ID 4, even in the 8090 port. It is added in 8080 port, but now I'm able to see that in my 8090 port. How? It is because of Redis. If we use Redis, what will happen? If we use Redis is a distribution cache. So all my instances of my application, either it is running in the port 8080 or running in the port 8090, all will be pointing to a single cache, which is my distributed cache, and that cache will get refreshed every 5 seconds. That configuration we have given. So we have given that configuration in this time to live. So I'll show it quickly. Yeah, we have given it as 5 seconds, and that's the reason we are able to now see that entry in all my instances. So even if like I have like 10 instances, it will reflect it in all my 10 instances within 5 seconds. That's it. All well and good. We have implemented Redis cache in our application, and we have demoed it as well. We just now see how Redis caching works, but there are many caching providers, but we discussed Redis in our example, and Redis is open source. You can see that I have just downloaded Redis from Docker and I have used it. It's not licensed, it's open source, and it is a in-memory data store. Also, this Redis can be used as a database, cache, message broker, or even as a streaming engine. So it's very easy. We just saw that Redis is very simple. We just implemented this in our Spring framework application. So we now know there are like many configurations that I have left. I didn't explain. So there are lots of configurations in the Redis. Anyways, I'll provide you the code link. I'll give my GitHub repository. You can play with the code, and if you want a specific video on how you need to you want all the configurations of the Redis, let me know in the comment section. I'll cover a separate video for this Redis configuration alone. So, but the content of this video is about how to configure Redis in our Spring Boot application, and we just did it. There are many custom configurations that we can do. There are many custom configurations that we can do for the Redis cache manager as well. If you want a separate video, as I told earlier, please let me know in the comment section. I'll do it. If you like the content, please like, share, comment. So, and also please make sure that you subscribe the video if you're watching it. Stay tuned for the updates. Thank you for watching. Crack it.